The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining our town hall meeting today for Alberta. Just want to let you know, I know I've spoken to many of you on the phone and really challenging times out there. I know it's very stressful, a lot of sleepless nights, and we're working our best at Restaurants Canada to see if we can get through this all together with as little damage as possible. So today's webinar, I'm going to go over just a few slides on the economic impact and some of our survey information that we got back. Then we'll talk about some of the federal programs that have been announced, go through some of those details. The provincial relief measures announced thus far, we'll go through that as well, and then talk a little bit about reopening, and that's basically the agenda for today's meeting. So next slide, please. Can we get the next slide up? Alex, next slide, please.
Hi, sorry, you should have it right now.
Oh. All right, so let's talk first about some of the economic situation that we're in right now. No surprise to any of you that with respect to your same-store sales compared to a year ago, the COVID situation already started to impact our sales quite significantly in February. As you can see, 46% of respondents showed lower sales already in February by 46%. And as well, then in the first 2 weeks of March, when the social distancing measures were put in place, that quickly dropped to 78%. And of course, the last 2 weeks of March and going forward, we're obviously everybody's in the same boat where you're not getting your same sales. So next slide, please. And when we're talking about the year-over-year change in restaurant sales, as you can see, the first half of March, your sales were down about 27%. Second half of March, about 72% when the social distancing measures came in place. So overall, total March was down close to 50% as far as your sales are concerned. And then, of course, what we're anticipating for the sales for April and May are roughly 80% down from what you usually are. Next slide, please. So in our latest survey, or sorry, in our first survey, we also asked you how many of you are temporarily closed down, how many of you are likely to stay open for takeout and delivery, and roughly half of our members, they closed down all their operations temporarily until the social distancing measures are lifted. And about another 38% have temporarily closed down their in-dining operations, but are still offering some degree of takeout and delivery. And what was also very concerning in our first survey, of course, is that we had close to 10% of our members that were saying that they were already permanently closed, and you know, some of them were seasonal operations, so they weren't really affected yet. But of course, that was in our first survey, and our second survey, as you can see, if we can go to the next slide, please. Sorry, is what we discovered there is there's a huge problem with respect of insurmountable debts that are coming up. And where 76% of you said rent was the #1 issue that's contributing to these mounting debt levels. And of course, 61% paying suppliers property taxes. So moving on to the federal emergency measures that have been announced. You're probably very familiar with these, probably even more so than I am, but of course the first big one was the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which is a taxable benefit providing $2,000 a month for up to 4 months for workers who lose their income as a result of the COVID pandemic. And CERB is only available to laid off employees who do not have work. And the CERB program is obviously not available to those who voluntarily leave their jobs. And it's administered by the Canada Revenue Agency, which will enable them to certainly catch fraudsters who are inappropriately accessing the program. Other criteria measures in there was that you must have earned $5,000 in 2019. And employees, and this was a change that we advocated for as well, that employees are allowed to earn up to $1,000 a month while collecting CRB. And it's retroactive to March 15th. And as you know, it's for about a 16 weeks, so basically 4 months of payments. And of course, beneficiaries must let CRA know as soon as they're not eligible. And you also must have 14 consecutive days without work to be eligible. But I understand the program's working well, and actually maybe too well for some people, whereas we're hearing some people don't want to come back to their part-time jobs because they're very comfortable getting that CERB payment. Next program, next slide, please. So with respect to the Canada Emergency Business Account, many of you will be aware of this. This is the CEBA program's providing loans to small businesses to pay operating costs such as payroll, rent, utilities, insurance, property tax, or debt servicing, 100% funded by the Government of Canada. It's available to employers with between $20,000 and $1.5 million in total payroll for 2019, and operating as of March 1st, 2020. And this is expanded to include 50% of alcohol sales. Financial institutions will provide interest-free loans of up to $4,000 to eligible businesses. And if you repay that amount by December 31st, 2022, 25% will be forgiven. And if it's not repaid by December 2022, the balance will be converted to a 3-year term loan at 5% interest. So I know many of you are looking at that program and accessing it as well. Next slide, please. So then there's also, as far as relief for businesses, is the EDC loan guarantee for small and medium-sized enterprises. And this program provides credit and cash flow loans through various financial institutions and credit unions to small and medium-sized enterprises. Canadian businesses have to be financially viable and have revenue generating prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. So that's the eligibility. This allows financial institutions to issue operating credit and cash flow loans of up to $6.25 million to existing clients, with 80% of that guaranteed by the Export Development Corporation. And this money is to be used for operational expenses only. Next program, please, or next slide. Next slide. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Okay, now we're on to, this is probably the biggest one. Oh, sorry. Next slide. There we go. The biggest program so far announcement to date, and certainly what we've been hearing very clearly from all of you, rent is the #1 issue that is keeping you awake at night. And we appreciated the Prime Minister's announcement of the CECRA program, which is a federal provincial program which will lower rent by 75% for small businesses that have been affected by COVID-19. As you know, there's still details to be worked out on this, and we're hoping to have some clarity on all of this expected in May. And there's a lot of confusion between the federal and provincial governments on how this will work. There's also some pushback from renters, which we can discuss later. But the concept is to provide forgivable loans to qualifying commercial property owners to cover up to 50% of rent payments for tenants who are expecting financial hardship during the months of April, May, and June. Eligible for tenants who pay less than $50,000 a month in rent and have temporarily closed or experienced a minimum of 70% drop in pre-COVID revenues. And I know that there have been some concerns on that particular 70% number. There are also a lot of concerns about any sort of stick to make sure the landlords are actually participating in the program. Landlord loans will be forgiven if mortgage property owners reduces rent by at least 75% under a rent forgiveness agreement, which includes a no eviction clause. And tenants will still be on the hook to pay the remaining 25% of the rent. And if this program works properly, it would be a real big benefit, and I think makes the difference of whether or not many of you can remain open through the reopening period or not. So But once again, I know there's a lot of problems and a lot of questions that you have on this particular program, and we're certainly identifying those gaps as we had with other programs to the federal government and the provincial governments to see if we can't get some fixes on how that program works. Next slide, please. And the other big program, of course, that you'll all be very familiar with was the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which was originally 10%, but we've lobbied and we've now got that to a 75% wage subsidy. The revenue drop, you have to demonstrate a revenue drop of at least 30% or more to be eligible. And that 30% revenue drop is compared to the same months in 2019 or an average of January, February of 2020. And you only need to show about a 15% decline for March 2020. And the January to February period can also be used for new businesses. And the wage subsidies will be retroactive to March 15th and in place till October 3rd for a maximum period of 12 weeks. And I know we've heard from many of you that would like more flexibility so that 12 weeks could come later, or to extend that 12 weeks to 24 weeks. We're well aware of this, and we're certainly providing that feedback to the federal government to make this as helpful as possible for our members. And also just to know that an employee that receives CERB and the wage can't get the wage subsidy and the CERB at the same time. Next slide, please. So moving on from those, there's several federal programs. The Alberta provincial government has also done some things to help business thus far, and I know there's still more on the way. And of course, the first week of this pandemic, understanding where this was likely going, Restaurants Canada lobbied intensely in the days before that week of March 15th. And I know in Alberta, anyways, we had talked about this as something we wanted to do anyways. So it was a really quick fix. And literally the day that Alberta announced their state of emergency on March 17th, they also announced that the alcohol sales for takeout and delivery would be in place indefinitely. And of course, that is supposed to be in conjunction with food orders, not just selling liquor on its own. And there were some criteria about ProServe, getting drivers to get ProServe certified. But really, AGLC has been pretty good as far as allowing us some flexibility on that. And they're not really being that tough on the compliance and enforcement. But we certainly don't want to see that jeopardized by people running amok with the intent of that particular regulation to allow alcohol for takeout and delivery. Then, of course, they announced a number of other measures, such as the education freeze and deferral, which reverses the 3.5% increase, and that's supposed to be a savings of $87 million for businesses in 2021. And also deferring the education property tax for 6 months, leaving an additional $458 million in cash with employers, which should be reflected in lower rent lease payments. And as you know, some municipalities are also deferring their property taxes, which is helpful, i.e. Calgary to September 30th. One of the things that Alberta did that we're asking other provinces to follow suit on is on WCB premiums. Not only are they being deferred, but for small, medium-sized businesses, they're also being reduced. So as you know, you're getting a one-year deferral on your premiums until early 2021. And employers who paid their 2020 premiums are eligible for a rebate. And small, medium-sized businesses are also getting a 50% reduction in their 2020 WCB premiums. Next slide, please. So other provincial supports that have been announced thus far in Alberta are obviously the corporate income tax deferral, which is the same as the federal government. That is going to be deferred to August 31st, 2020. And that measure provides an extra $1.5 billion in liquidity to help businesses cope with COVID-19. Also announced is utility payment deferral for all small businesses, and that provides 90 days of deferral for electricity and natural gas payments. So that's another pretty key issue. But I just want to say on those provincial supports that I know the Alberta government has been working on through economic development on further relief measures, and in fact, I will be speaking with Minister Furr, the Economic Development Minister, later this afternoon on that particular issue. Next slide, please. So after we've talked about rent and we've talked about all these programs to help us stay in business, obviously, as you know, all the provinces, starting with Saskatchewan late last week, are now getting into that reopening phase. And fortunately, our social distancing and our various public health measures have flattened the curve enough that we're now into the reopening phase of this. And I understand that Alberta is getting close to finalizing the reopening plans. And from what I've heard so far, what they plan to announce is probably pretty similar with what Saskatchewan has announced, with a few Alberta-specific exceptions. So we're expecting that, if not on Friday, early next week, as far as that plan. And in preparation for that, Restaurants Canada is also finalizing its reopening plan recommendations and best practices, including an option on how to use revised floor seating plans instead of capacity restrictions. So for example, if they come out with a 50% capacity rule, if you can actually put a floor plan, which may be 52%, 44%, 48%, a floor plan that shows that you're respecting all the physical distancing measures and you've got all the hygiene practices in place, that your health inspector should give you a little bit of leeway on that anticipated 50% capacity based on what your floor plan would look like. So again, as you're probably very familiar with, the likely restaurant requirements would require no more than 50% capacity. And as I just mentioned, we've got that approved sort of seating plan as a less prescriptive option, hopefully as an option. There's got to be a 2-meter separation between patrons, or some sort of a plexiglass or other physical barrier between, say, back-to-back booths or tables that way. What's going to be included in this plan, obviously, is meticulous disinfection, very frequent hand washing, washing of surfaces, and a lot of specifics around best practices for your staff. And obviously, we have to find a way, whether it's thermometer checks for our employees as they come in, to make sure that we're identifying as best as possible, that ensuring that our staff are going to be safe serving their patrons. There's going to be some training required for that, obviously, and there could be some expense as well, as you have to do this and perhaps hire and buy PPE, because if staff are working together, it's likely going to be that you're going to require that these staff members are wearing masks. But again, we'll be getting all this into, and we're very close to finalizing our plan. If we can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there we go. So Restaurants Canada's, whoops, nope, back one. Sorry about that, Alex. One back, please. So Restaurants Canada Reopening Best Practices Guide, we've had a team of our directors and members from across the country looking at what our best practice guidance should look like. We're also looking at other jurisdictions, the NRA, there's BCRFA here that we're working with on their plan as well. And we're trying to take those best practices and putting them all together into a reopening guidance, a best practices guide for all food service operators. And we're also preparing a more fulsome handbook with restaurants with protocols and practices to employ when food service operations are allowed to reopen. So that is probably going to be done tomorrow, or at the very latest Friday this week. And we'll certainly be putting that up on our website when it's ready to go. And obviously our plan as well with the various public health officers, including with Dr. Hinshaw in Alberta, of just preparing in the next few weeks, preparing for that likely reopening period, which we're thinking is going to be, in Alberta's case, early June as well. So that is just a recap, basically, of the federal provincial programs and some of the economic and survey information. I know many of you have got many questions, especially on the federal programs announced so far. And at this point, I am ready to take any questions that you have for the next 10 minutes. Okay, so just to get that started, I know many of you are asking about the rent relief, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. We are certainly pushing the federal government to extend the period from June 6th through to September to ensure that we either get that flexibility on when that 12 weeks will happen. I know I've talked to some of you on this, or even better, obviously, would be extending that period from 12 weeks to 24 weeks. So that is one of the big questions that we're getting. A lot of questions as well on the emergency commercial rent relief plan. This is kind of tough because it's a federal government program that's supposed to be done with the provinces. I know some of the provinces were not comfortable with how this program is being laid out. You know, as a result of it, I think what we're advocating for is payments be made to us instead of to the landlords. And also we're asking the provincial governments, and they're somewhat reluctant because of legislative hurdles to get over to figure out how we can stop those non-evictions from happening. I know many of you are still getting notices from your landlords to say paying the full amount. And the other thing we're saying, there has to be some sort of a stick involved for the landlord that they to participate in the program, because we're certainly hearing from some less reasonable landlords that they're just not willing to participate in the program. And if you can't pay your full rent, hand over the keys. And so we're certainly working on that. We're gathering all your feedback on what we can do to help that program be more successful. But I realize as well that time is of the essence here, and we need some answers to some of these questions pretty quickly. And I would really like to hear any of your personal situation examples that we can provide the scenarios that are happening out there right now back to the federal and provincial governments. And as I mentioned before as well, a lot of questions I'm getting is what's next in Alberta, where are they going to go? And I guess the only thing I can say there is stay tuned. We're expecting some more relief to happen even a couple of weeks ago, but I think the whole rent program piece sort of deflected some of that from the provinces. But we are continuing to ask for more and more relief from the provincial governments, realizing that we are going to be in this for several months, not just a 3-month period, and we'll get back to normal. We're trying to make sure that they understand that even under a reopening scenario, through that reopening scenario, that we can stay successful and at least pay our bills and break even for the months to come under that reopening scenario. Another question I'm getting from one of you online is, have we heard anything about VLTs turning on as part of the reopen? I have not heard that, but based on what's happened in Saskatchewan, VLTs or any sort of public spaces, whether it be pool tables or dance floors, that will not be included in that initial reopen plan. That will probably be more in the later phases when we talk about opening up bars. The public health officers are very concerned that as soon as you open up these sort of common areas for entertainment and other things where VLTs will fall into that they're not doing that. However, I will certainly mention the VLT case, and if you have some ideas on VLTs and how you can do that while respecting social distancing, we shall certainly put in that recommendation as well, that VLTs be open. I know it's an important revenue source for many of you. that is about it for what the questions. If there are any other more questions, please add them to the chat. Also, if you have any questions whatsoever, you can always reach out to me at restaurantscanada.org, mark at restaurantscanada.org, and please do follow what we're saying on Twitter at Restaurants West, and share any sort of concerns that you have, and certainly help amplify our messages to the federal and provincial politicians that we're still in this critical phase where in the next few weeks we'll determine, I think, how many people in our industry are going to survive this and how many are just going to permanently close. Sorry, getting a few more questions here. So got a question here about the 1.5 million payroll to qualify for CEBA. And I presume that is with the maximum, is that at all flexible? And I'm sorry, don't have an answer to that question, but perhaps you can, whoever asked that question can loop back with me afterwards and we can talk about that. The other things about the eligibility criteria is you know, if you're hiring too many people to qualify for assistance, or if you don't quite meet the thresholds, those are all things that we want to hear back from you. So once again, please email me with any sort of concerns or any, even more importantly, recommendations on how we could fix that. It's really difficult with some of these programs, and we've been advocating for some flexibility, because once you start setting hard numbers around this, you know, we think there should be some sort of a variance in that, because, you know, what happens if you're at 31% sales for rent, or if, you know, you're just on the margins of those things. And up to now, the federal government's been relatively responsive to looking at tweaks and changes, and you know, with you providing us that input, we'll make sure we're feeding it into the Prime Minister's office or the Premier's office as well. The other question that we got is about the whole relationship with Skip the Dishes and other third-party delivery companies. As you may have seen with me in the media, I've been talking about this as well as I don't know if Paul Schufelt's on the call, but I've certainly sent some media his way as well after he did a great Facebook post highlighting on a blackboard the economics between using third-party deliveries or not. And what I've said in the media and what our position is, and unless these third-party delivery companies sharpen their pencils to make sure that this is a win-win for both the restaurant and the third-party delivery company, we have an increasing number of members that are asking for us to call for a cap on those fees, as San Francisco announced a couple of weeks back, capping those third-party fees to 15%. So once again, just I know we're getting close to the end of the half hour here. I just want to thank you for your attention. I know that many of you are very familiar with the programs that we already discussed today, and I'm happy to chat with any of you offline. Please send me an email to mark@restaurantscanada.org. Give me a call, or certainly reach out to me any other way. And happy to chat with you. And good luck with all of you to make the right decisions. Hopefully, many of you can find a way to get through this and to the other side. And we all look forward to working together to ensure that we have a prosperous Alberta restaurant industry in the future once we get through this very challenging time. So thank you very much for your attention, and that is the end of today's webinar.